All right, Elizabeth Nickson, thank you for joining us in Grimerica. How are you?
I'm very well. I'm pleased to be here.
Awesome. We're pleased to have you. It's funny, I didn't realize it. It's interesting being on Substack, and I started reading your Substack, and I'm thinking, man, this is just amazing. I'd love to have her on the show. And then, I started reaching out to you, and I didn't realize until fairly lately that you're Canadian too, and that you've started to cover a lot of this Canadian stuff. So now we're back talking about Canada again, which we've sort of purposely made an effort to hit Canadian topics again. But yeah, it's pretty interesting reading about about Vancouver and the places where I grew up as well. So there's some commonalities there for sure.
Yeah, I think the big world has come to Canada in not a good way. I mean, we used to be kind of an innocent country, right? I mean, the country I grew up in was peaceful and sweet-natured, and now all hell is broken loose. I mean, Vancouver is the one that really upsets me, partly because both sets of great-grandparents, paternal great-grandparents, moved here in the 1880s or 1870s. And, the city that they built for 100 years that welcomed hundreds of thousands of people from all over the world, they built the sidewalks, they built the water system, they built the hospital, they built the bridges, and they dug the tunnels, and they were contractors, right, from Liverpool. And it's like it's a CCP criminal cartel there now. I mean, it's disgusting what's happened. People are dying on the street in front of the hospital that my great-grandmother founded in a goddamn tent. So I'm quite exercised about Canada right now. I think a lot of people are. I understand that the Conservative members of Parliament all walked out of Parliament this afternoon because of some sort of censorship thing that the Speaker of the House did, and I think that's great.
He kicked out Pierre. He kicked out Pierre for calling Justin a wacko.
Yeah,
or
awesome.
wacko.
That's awesome. Finally, they're standing up. And when I saw a feed of them standing outside Parliament, they all looked really cross. It's about time that they were angry about what's being done rather than polite. That's just my
Yeah, I don't know if we should go further down that thing, or if we should sort of talk a bit about the context of your experience, because you've done some original research as well. You've got some really interesting takes on what Canadians used to be like, men and women. Do you want to touch on that? Maybe a little bit more about your personal experience.
Okay, so I left Canada after graduate school because I just thought there were just no opportunities for somebody like me. It was basically, I was going to end up fundraising for the arts. That was the career that I'd been sort of maneuvered into by the fact that there was really nothing else. So I moved to New York and decided to become a writer. And over a few years in New York, I taught myself to write. And then I got a job at Time magazine in London, and they taught me what to do. They gave me everything. I mean, it was like 7 years of just force feeding my brain, and they just shoved me into situations where it was basically dropping a 4-year-old into a swimming pool over and over and over again, and my brain just it just was so happy, and it grew so fast that I kind of mutated into another kind of human being. After about 7 years there, I wanted to do something deeper. I'd found out that my mother had been an experimental subject in the CIA's mind control program at the Allen Memorial in Montreal, which clarified a lot about my childhood. And so I decided to write a book about that. And so I moved. Are you getting feedback? Am I screwing up here?
No, it's all good.
Okay, so I moved to Bermuda and lived with one of my oldest friends, and I wrote the book, and it was published in London and in Canada and in Holland, and it was called The Monkey Puzzle Tree, and that just sent me into another level of the journalism profession. So I could basically write for anyone as long as I had a decent idea. So I went through a sort of journeyman phase where I wrote for the Telegraph and the Independent and the Guardian and the Harper's magazine in New York and British Vogue and just everybody. And then I moved back to Canada and had to find something. I mean, I used to joke that, if I moved back to Canada, I'd end up writing about trees and fish. And I didn't want to do that. But I had to move back because my mother was fragile after my father died. And so I moved home and I ended up writing about the environmental movement. Now, I grew up in the country and I was sympathetic to the movement. I had bought 30 acres on Salt Spring Island when I was outbid on a flat in London. I put some money down and I paid on the land. So I decided to build a house here, and it's one of the nodes of the environmental movement. So I wrote a piece for Harper's magazine about the founding of sort of the green movement on Salt Spring. It was called Where the Bee Sucks, and they told me to write it in the style, character, and plot of The Tempest by Shakespeare. So I figured out how to do that over a period of time. It was published and all hell broke loose on the island. They hated it so much. So they would just phone me over and over. They'd drive into my driveway at night and at midnight with rock and roll blaring. And then there was one letter after another to the local papers about how horrible I was. And so at that point, I started to say, well, hang on a minute. What the hell is happening here? I had no, it was complete. It was actually a fable. It was funny and it was sweet. And so I thought, well, okay, there's obviously something happening here that's not kosher. And what is it? So I started asking questions. And the more questions I asked and the more people I talked to, the more I realized that the movement was engaged in a systematic shutting down of free enterprise in the country, of logging, fishing, farming, ranching, and any kind of rural life. So I started writing about that for the Globe and Mail and the National Post, and that was also inflammatory, and people really hated me, and then also people really loved me. So I was caught in this very sort of hot place, which also made me think, well, this is actually a story. This is a big story. This is a big story nobody's telling. And so I managed to get Adam Bellow at HarperCollins to commission a book about what the environmental movement had done to rural America and Canada, but mostly America. And I got in my car and I drove 20,000 miles over a period of a couple of years and talked to people all over the states. I mean, not in the Southeast, but the Southwest, the mountain states, the coastal, the forests, and the whole 9 yards. And we published this book called Eco-Fascists: How Radical Conservationists. My browser has lost connection to my camera.
Oh, weird. Okay, yeah, you were frozen for a little while there, but your audio still sounds really good.
Okay.
Browser connection to the camera.
That's weird.
Yeah, just you can continue on if you want.
Yeah. Okay, so I've got my camera here.
If you change cameras, then it's going to show, like, it's going to change it to your laptop one, which will be right there. Oh, there you go. You're back. Yeah.
Good. Yeah. So we published this book, and it was really about Agenda 2030, and
was it Agenda 21 back then, or
it was Agenda 21 then, exactly. And I used to, I mean, I made friends, and I said, look, to one of them, I said, look, every time you mention Agenda 21, I want to leave the room because it's so paranoid and it's so crazy. And he looked at me and he nodded and smiled, and he really didn't answer my question. But over time, I accepted that this was right, because in fact, what the regulatory system was doing was catch-22. If you follow this rule, you were breaking another rule. So as a result, what was happening was everybody was being forced out of business. So, for instance, in a industrial forest in eastern Washington state, once you eliminate one logging job, you've already automatically eliminated 7 others, because that's the multiplier in the country. So when you shut down a forest because of the spotted owl, you lose entire communities. They all go into crisis. People get on drugs. They're desperate. Families fail. They're driven out of the country, and everybody goes into the city. So I worked out that they had cleared about 14 million Americans off the land into cities. And in fact, they were doing the same thing in Africa. They were doing the same thing in Southeast Asia. They were doing the same thing anywhere that the UN had power. They were clearing the countryside of rural people deliberately and shoving them into cities. And in the case of Africa, into tent cities, where people would starve and get sick and die. So, that was the story of eco-fascists, and it's become extremely fashionable or well known about now. The book was published in early 2013, so there was a fair amount of press about it, but the public didn't really get it. I think they're getting it now.
I was just going to ask that. Is it stood the test of time in a way?
Oh yeah, it's like still selling and still extremely relevant in the sense that people are just waking up to what's happening. Thank God.
So
Yeah.
interesting path. So because I was really curious after reading all the different topics that you cover in your Substack, like whether it's the eco-fascist stuff or the election fraud or the Canada's decline or the great replacement, the problem with the sort of men and women these days, like our cultural Marxist shift into the brainwashing, all these topics that you covered. I was like, how did you go from this mainstream writing to all these different topics? And it almost sounds like it was partly because you went to this little island and started asking questions.
Yeah.
I mean, is that where, like, how long have you been interested in all this other stuff, or has that always sort of been in the background?
Well, I have a kind of wide-ranging mind.
Yeah.
Anyway, and as you can see, I have a lot of books. But I don't know. That's just the way I'm built. And the thing is that luckily I fell into Time Inc. and I got trained by the best researchers and editors and writers in the world at that time. That they were just the best. And so I learned how to do it properly. And so when I left the mainstream, I carried my skills with me and my interests, right? So, I mean, I would sit in the library at Time Magazine, and there'd be 2 sort of librarians, and they would walk me through a subject. And I learned how to order information and the thing about Time was that it was a middle brow. It had to be understood by everybody. It wasn't written to the elite. It wasn't written to the highly educated. It was written to high school principals. That was our ideal audience. So that was the great gift that that outfit gave me, was that ability.
Interesting. So speaking of the elites and stuff, can you talk a little bit about like where your other research went to when like looking back into old albums, family albums, and like what you found with
Oh yeah,
sort of, I mean, I'd love to get into some of that too. Yeah. Also, what I don't want to leave out is because it reminds me of what Naomi Wolf has said recently about sort of bumping elbows with these people at these elite parties and just seeing what they think of the masses. I really like to get your take on that as well.
Yeah. Well, let's see. Okay. So I grew up in Westmount. And my father's family were, I guess they were ancillary members. They had been in the American Revolution, and they dug the first deep cut on the Welland Canal, and they were massive infrastructure builders. And so that sort of glory from the 1800s still clung to them, even though they didn't have the money that the Molsons and Morgans and Birkses and McConnells, they were part of that club. So I grew up going to school with those people and spending time in their houses and going to all the parties that they had when you were 16. This sort of round of parties would start that were pretty much a couple hundred parties a year that you had to go to. And so I learned how these people operated. I didn't like it. By the time I was 17, I was in full rebellion. So when I got out of it, I didn't go back. I still have friends there, but I don't really speak to them much. But what happened was that after I published The Monkey Puzzle Tree, my father gave me a fragment of a memoir of my great-great-grandmother, Charlotte St. John, who at the age of 20 in 1850 declared marriage was slavery and set off to see the world. So my publishers became very interested in her because here was a feminist heroine in 1850. But what interested me was this family that she was a member of. Her grandfather, my great-great-great-grandfather, was he had dug part of the Erie Canal. He'd done the 14 locks at Lockport, which were, I think, very enormously complicated. His father died in debtor's prison, so he had no education. And he was one of those titanic figures that, history throws up, or every family probably has one or two of them if they look hard enough. And he became God-struck at one point. He had a full-on encounter with an archangel overlooking his works at Lockport. He was up on the mountain. I don't know what he was doing there, but an archangel appeared in front of him. And on the cover of his funeral program, there's this cowering man and this giant archangel with full-on wings over it. And from then on, he became this monster of charity. And they became officers on the Underground Railroad. They started schools and churches and schools and churches, and they just built this extraordinary world around themselves, and it was pretty impressive, and that excited me more than anything, but because it wasn't anything that I had learned in history. So if I went back further in that family, they had arrived in 1630, and so had my mother's family, and they both ended up in the Connecticut River Valley, and they were part of the first, second, and third Great Awakenings of the American Republic, which proved to me that, if you go through all of the founding documents of Burke, Locke, Montesquieu, all the Greeks, the whole Roman law thing, but alongside of it was this extraordinary, ecstatic Christianity that fed the building of both countries. I found it distressing at first, because I'm a modernist, right? I the idea of ecstatic Christianity and speaking in tongues and falling to the ground and becoming possessed by God, by all the people that I knew in my family growing up, seemed so preposterous that it was hardly real. But in fact, it had just been papered over and forgotten, and everybody had become sort of prosperous and realist. And so that's probably something that nobody else I know of writes about or talks about peculiarly. And because if they were prominent, they left letters and journals and all kinds of wonderful documents. So I know it to be true. It's primary research.
So was that whole elite, going back to sort of your growing up and experiencing the elite sort of milieu, was that kind of a materialistic one, very not spiritual?
Well, they certainly all went to church on Sunday. It was pretty important, but I think it was if you didn't, you weren't part of the club. You had to at least profess Christian values. And all the women, though they didn't work, were involved in charitable work. And it was more of I would say it was getting to the point where it's performative, the way it is now. You go to charity balls and you give money. The women that I grew up actually dug in and did things. Prior to that, it was everything that they did do. Sorry. If you go back to the 1900s, from let's say 1880, that was the social gospel, and that determined the culture. It absolutely determined the culture. Anybody who had money, the women spent their lives working. So I can pull schedules from 6:30 in the morning to 9:30 at night. Their days were absolutely full with doing the things that we have now given to Marxists who hate us. Right?
So this goes back to that 1850 feminist heroine that you talk about, where,
Well,
or
she
no,
was.
no, it doesn't. No, that's different, right? So, but you're
Well, she
so
was
what you're
earlier. She was
what yeah
earlier.
so what you're saying is that it's almost a different view of that than we obviously than we have sort of in the mainstream right now with the women, right? I mean, they were out there working, doing the stuff like you
Yeah.
said, volunteering, making schools, like actually putting all these things together, organizing things.
Yeah, they ran everything.
They ran everything, huh?
They ran everything. The men made money, and they were obviously heads of the family, but the women ran the culture, in the sense that they made sure that I explain it this way. This is the best way for me to explain it. My great aunt B knew where every sparrow fell in Vancouver. That's how they operated. They knew where every sparrow fell. Every poor family, every family who lost a father, every sick woman. That's how they operated. A lot of it was through the church, but a lot of it was through their various societies. So yeah, that's
Well,
how.
that's a really important way to put it, because people don't think that, without your government's assistance, how are you going to get by, right? I mean, that's one of the big sort of feminist things right now. And I understand it. Like, even my people that are close to me would say, well, if I don't, work and be able to support myself,
Yeah,
and I'm just for a man, and if something happens to him and he's like, well, how do I support myself? That kind of thing, because I think we've been sort of brainwashed to think that the government has to help us and fix these things. And what you're sort of saying is that there was a cultural structure ran by women that would help people through these things,
yeah,
right?
yeah, and I mean, it reached through to everybody. I tell everybody that asks me that Jamie's in my family. We have 4 Indian bands in our bloodline. We have Mohawk, Blackfoot, Assiniboine, and Jamie's eldest son is part Métis. And they were part of the world that we lived in, and now they've completely been shoved. They've been turned into a Marxist activist group that's used to punish and shame the culture.
Wow. Yeah.
So
and let's remind people that this is from, you're talking about original documents, right? Like this is from the daytimers and schedules and notes and writings from people back then, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Like you went through thousands of them, right?
Yeah. Pauline Johnson was my great-grandmother's first cousin through her Indian father, Johnson, who was one of the chiefs of the Mohawk tribe on the Grand River reserves. So, and Jamie's great-grandmother was full-blooded Assiniboine, and she and her husband, he was called the Emperor of the Peace, and they worked together against the Hudson's Bay Company in the early 1900s. They farmed the Peace River. So, I mean, what's happened is very aggravating.
I wonder because my grandma used to get after it too. After she was the cook at the daycare when I was there, and she was doing all this other stuff with the Legion and all this stuff, but she didn't have a fucking cell phone or like cable TV or HBO. It's like, because everything's there that, well, and I mean, at that time, she didn't really need to worry about working as much as, the working was more for fun than for income.
Yeah.
Now it seems like everyone needs to work just to barely scrape by in most situations. But, I do still wonder how much, even if it wasn't for the work, and how much of these phones and just the you can throw on Netflix anytime, you can kind of instantly be entertained at any given moment, where like my grandma didn't really have that option. I'm not saying she would have taken it even if she did, but because there obviously was a lot more responsibility to community back then than there is today. Today there's almost none.
Yeah.
And I don't know really, what to attribute, because clearly there's an agenda, but a lot of it just seems to be by our own design. We just as a culture, we just keep taking the easy way. It's like everyone I know is more emotional and jacked up right now than I ever see them throughout the entire year, because it's like the NHL playoffs, and I'm like, I don't even know what's happening. But everyone's excited, they're honking their horns, they're cheering, they're jacked up on social media. Let's go team. My grandma, even I remember, like when I was a kid, just watched, she's like, that shit's all fake. Quit wasting your time. And
right.
I just don't know that we have we're responsible enough to run this shit anymore. I really don't. I don't know that we have what it takes. I feel like we haven't grown up. Most of us just haven't grown up.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think people, when they try to do something in community, they're driven by their egos, because that's how working life is run. It's all about how advantages and getting things done in a way that sort of defeats the other person. You're always competing for money and position and power and recognition. But if you work in the community, that's exactly it's totally flipped around. It has to be not your ego, not your self-importance. You always have to subsume yourself in the work. So my father, when he retired at 55, he knew how to do that, probably because of the tradition in his family of doing it, which we've lost. But my mother, for instance, once She was supposed to redecorate a house down near the beach in Jericho for old people to come and have tea in the afternoons and be by the ocean. And she picked a fight with everybody. And my father said, well, you know, your mother, she just can't do this kind of work. She's not capable of it, because it demands a certain kind of not self-sacrifice, but subsuming the self in service. And we have been trained by our culture to think only about ourselves, right? And our importance and how cool we look and all of that stuff. We've lost the ability to have character, really. I'm certainly guilty of that myself. So,
because there's plenty of hours in the day. I mean, everyone talks about how busy they are, you know, but I would just argue, like, even in my little town here, if we added up the amount of fucking television that gets watched, you know, between the screen time on the phone and the television that's getting watched in a day, we probably got, you know,
yeah,
20,000 hours or 30,000 hours a day, whether it's in the evenings or the, you know, outside of this or outside of that, that could be attributed to something other than what's being done with it. You know, it's video games, it's Netflix, it's cell phones. So, you know, and I'm guilty of it too. You know, I'm right there. You know, we do this. It's supposed to be a job, though. It's not really a donation. It just
right.
comes off that way because.
Yeah.
I got a question here then. So what changed? You mentioned about, you know, the indigenous and the four Indian bands there, and then something shifted, you said. I guess the question would be, what shifted back then, and is that still sort of happening now? Is that part of what's happening now? Like, it's hard. It's like Darren mentioned too, it feels like an agenda. Sometimes it's hard to sort of pinpoint where that agenda affects us right now, but I think you've put some pretty good threads together to show what's going on.
Yeah, I think it was a deliberate. It was deliberate. It was an attempt to break what we had here, and they did it. They did a really good job with the First World War, and then they did a really good job with the Second World War, and they killed a lot of us off. And I think it was engineered. I think both those wars were engineered. Certainly the First War was engineered for money. And one of the reasons that it was engineered was because they wanted to break America. They wanted to break the States, and they wanted to break Canada. It was getting too strong. The people were getting too independent. They were too motivated. And yeah, I think just like the guy that wrote that book about Laurel Canyon in the 60s, I think that was deliberate too. I think that all came out of Tavistock and the Royal Institute for this and that. And you know, I met those people in London, and they're not smarter than us. They're just meaner, and they have more money and more power. And they wanted to destroy us, and they did. I mean, we have been busted back to infantile status. I don't know one person that wouldn't fit into Darren's description. Not one, not anywhere in my family. We've all been turned into passive consumers of junk. Right?
Yeah, but you've also written quite a bit about how positive it's getting. I mean, how many people are pushing back in the States. There's a whole like underground sort of how do I even say it? A network of people that are sort of pushing back, taking things to courts. Like there is a whether, you know, how, I don't even know if I want to use the word populist, but I mean, you did in your writing, and I'm fine with it, but a populist movement coming back. So, you know, I kind of flip flop back and forth too. You know, I know we're totally brainwashed, but also people are waking up more than ever all over. And it seems like there's a huge shift coming. And though I love the way you write about it, because you're like, they can't contain it all, right? Their lies are so obvious. They sort of can't help, but it can't help but fall apart.
Yeah, I mean, if they tried something like a new bug or a new or some sort of anything that they try between now and November's election, people are just going to mock. Nothing, they can't really scare anybody anymore. They've kind of done the worst, right? They I mean, people have brought up to me the fact that they're planning this and they're planning that. And I said, go ahead, do it. Because the more horrible things they do, the more people wake up and say, no, it's not going to happen on my lifetime. I'm going to do something about it. And people are doing things about it. It's just that it just seems very, very hard. That's all. It's hard, and it's scary, and people get put in jail. I mean, published a series of 7 pieces on election fraud last month, not very long ago. And 2 of the people, one guy was arrested the day after my piece was published.
Wow.
The day after. And then somebody else was indicted and had to fly to Arizona and give herself up that same week. So sometimes I get a little squirrely,
Understandably, especially when you're writing about things like that in the States that are third rail topics. I mean, the election fraud thing, especially. I mean, you're hitting on like all the pretty heavy stuff, like the climate fraud, COVID, election fraud, eco-fascism. I mean, that's pretty much like the 4. And well, I mean, you could throw sort of the culture war in there too. And that's like the 5 main things you're not supposed to talk about right now.
I know, but what else is there to talk about, right?
So do you want to summarize? I mean, I don't want to get too far ahead on the Florida. Can we go back to your mom and the MK Ultra stuff before we get further down into the American stuff? So that wasn't in McGill. That was in a different place, I think you said, right?
That was the Allen Memorial at the what was it? It was the Montreal No, it wasn't the Montreal. It was Royal Victoria Hospital. Okay. So the Allen Memorial was up on top of Mount Royal. It was a house that was owned by the Allen family, which was a shipping family, and all their sons were killed in the First War and the Second War. They had 8 sons. 4 were killed in the First War, 4 were killed in the Second War. So how better to destroy a family than just to shoot? Okay, we're going to stage a war. We're going to make 2 million North Americans come over, and we're going to kill 750,000 of their men, and we're going to cripple the country for another 50 years. So they lost their house and they turned it into a hospital. Ewan Cameron was the psychiatrist. He was a Scot. He was a friend of Alan Dulles. Dulles picked him up because he'd written something about the Germans not being allowed to repeat what they've done. And they went over to Nuremberg together and went through all of the experiments that the Nazis were doing. And they got some ideas. They didn't want, their cover story was that they didn't want what the Nazis were doing to ever happen again. And they were going to devise a system to stop it. And their ideal would be that psychiatrists ran the world. So everybody would be put through this psychological profiling system, and they would be managed so that they would never become Nazis and try, I don't know, it was just stupid and arrogant. And so what happened was the McConnells, who were owners of the Montreal Star and a lot of other things, I think the cement companies, cement was sort of like Boardwalk there, everybody. So it was like Monopoly. This was the railroad family, and this was the beer family, and this was the alcohol family. And so the McConnells put some money into it, along with the Rockefellers, of course, and started this hospital up on top of the mountain. And they started experimenting on the mildly mentally ill, because the genuinely mentally ill, it wasn't a legitimate experiment. And I think it was Subproject 68, but it was it's pretty much the only one that has been fully laid out, because a couple of Canadian journalists got into the records and found out what they were doing. So yeah, my mother was part of it. We don't know how much. I do have her records, but they have been edited. Yeah, and there is an admission that is missing. And she managed to claw her way out of it. What happened to most of the patients was that they just had lived their lives in a fugue state, in a darkened room for 20 or 30 years. They were damaged people. Yeah, so that's what happened to my family.
Well, how old was your mom at that point? Because she was quite a, what would you call her, a savant? Or I mean, wasn't she very good at a whole bunch of different things? Like,
she was extraordinarily talented. She was a pianist, and she was a amateur athlete, and she got top marks at McMaster. So when she went in, she'd lost her first child, and 2 months after his death, and the child was 4 months when he died, I think, and 2 months after her death, she had what would be called a panic attack today, and she spent 2 weeks in the Allen, and that's where she met you and Cameron, and she became a patient of Cameron's for the next 20 years.
wow.
Yeah.
So do you think that had something to do with her excellence in stuff at all?
No, her excellence pulled her out of it. Oh, you mean, do you think they did it to her because she was so talented?
Well, no. Oh, that's the other side of it. Maybe. Yeah, that's a really good question. But I was wondering if that sort of unleashed some latent abilities or talents or.
Well, I mean, I think no, she had those skills before she went into the hospital. She was playing golf and playing the piano before, and she was good at it. And she graduated McMaster at the top of her class in political science and economics. So she was a going concern. I don't, I'm not really sure where her initial weakness came from, but they certainly widened it. That's what happened. And when she managed to get out of the most extreme invasive procedure period, that's when she started the physical exercise and, just really cross-country skiing in a blizzard. That she did a lot of that. And that pulled her out of it.
Wow. What a story. So then what was it like for you to find that? Did you even hear it? Had you heard about MK Ultra before that, or was that your
No, I had no idea about it. It was was pretty disorienting. And at the same time, I'd been interviewing people who had been tortured and falsely imprisoned. I'd had 2 years of that at the magazine. So, and I'm pretty sensitive anyway. So it kind of physically collapsed for quite a while. I mean, not in any sort of, I didn't need hospitalization, but I was exhausted and I had migraines for 3 days out of every week. So, I had to get out of the city and go to the country and recover and write my way out of it, which I did. And I, as Canadians, we tend to be pretty protected. And I lost all of my innocence, all of it. Every tiny little bit of innocence that I had was just gone. It was gone by the end of that.
Yeah, I often think about how protected we were back then. How, I don't know, I just feel like I grew up in a little bit of a bubble in a way that of just how, just everything about the culture, about racism, all that stuff was just like we were just I don't know, kind of in la la land in a way. I mean, I think back, I have fond memories of it now, thinking back to, I wish sort of we could just slide back into that state sometimes.
Yeah, I think a lot of people think that. I know Jamie thinks that. And I think we were actually solving those problems of racism and inequity and so on.
That's what I mean, and that's what I meant. I didn't explain it very well, but yeah, we were moving forward from all that. Like it felt like we were like like leaving the war and the Cold War, and we were moving forward in with with all these sort of progressive things, but not in a woke way, and just a human way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Darren, do you have anything?
Then bam, social media fucking ruined everything. I mean, honestly, I see no evidence that the phones and the social media are, because even when we first had the social media and it was just on, you had to like go on your computer to go on Facebook or whatever you're doing, I feel like even that would have been okay. We could have kept it if we could have kept it there. It would have been and this is coming from a guy who makes his living off the internet. But I really don't see any evidence that our evolution is at the point that we can like deal with the social media. I really don't. I think that seems to be the real